Hello everyone, and welcome to week 9 of English 121. This week we're going to be talking about imagery in poetry. I'm going to give you a lecture where we're going to talk through two really amazing examples of poems that use imagery. Then you're going to be doing a close reading of Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish as part of your conversation. And then you'll do a close reading of a poem that you'll choose based on, there's 3 different choices for your reflection journal. So let's talk a little bit about what imagery is and how it's used in a poem. Some of you might remember this picture of Ezra Pound that was on, it was in our first week of the class. I used it as one of the example photos. Imagery is really one of the most important tools that's used in a poem. It's a word or sequence of words that refers to any sensory experience. Excuse me. There's three different kinds of imagery. There's visual imagery. That's images that that you see with your eyes. There's auditory imagery that invokes the sound that the words invoke, and then there's tactile imagery, and that's sensory. That's like feeling things that you can touch and feel. When you look at all of the imagery that happens in a poem, you are looking at imagery. All of the images that happen in a poem is looking at the imagery, and the way that poets use imagery in poems is a way to really make abstract ideas, to put them into concrete terms. So a lot of what poetry works with is an emotional landscape. It's telling you something and trying to invoke in you a feeling. And how poetry does that is by using images. When you see, when you hear, when you touch something, you associate ideas and experiences with that thing. And what a poem is doing when it invokes that is it invokes all of the sensory connections you have with that thing. So let's look at how Ezra Pound is doing this in his very, very short poem, In a Station of the Metro. Now, just to give you some background, In the Station of the Metro is a poem that Ezra Pound wrote. He wrote it after leaving the metro. He was instantly inspired, and he went home and wrote 30 lines of a poem. And what he realized as he started to revise and revise and revise it is that the essence of the poem was found in these 2 lines. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. So what he's, when you want to close read this poem, and just so you know, Ezra Pound is thought of as one of the earliest poets who was an imagist. That means he tried to write poetry that was compelled, that was driven by imagery. Another great imagist poet is the poet Amy Lowell. And when you want to close read this poem, what you want to look at is first you want to look at every single word, including the title. So where, in a station of the metro. So where is the metro? We know that the metro is, there's a metro in Washington, D.C., right? It's an underground train. There's also a metro in Paris. And if we look at Ezra Pound's biography, we can see that he was living in Paris. He had lived in Paris and visited Paris. He was an expatriate, meaning he lived abroad before and during World War II. So by looking at the title and the word metro, we know this is set in Paris, in the metro station in Paris. So we're thinking of an underground experience. Then what is an apparition? An apparition, if you don't know the word, you got to look it up in the dictionary. An apparition has several different meanings, but one of which is like a ghost. It's something that like a ghostly image that is unexplainable. or it can actually, the actual root of apparition has to do with the word epiphany, right? And if we remember from fiction, an epiphany is when someone has a moment that changes them. They experience something that from that moment on they experience life differently. So you can look at the apparition and I can tell you that Ezra Pound knew the Greek root of this word when he was writing this poem. So let's think about it. What senses are being invoked by this poem, right? You have, you're in a dark tunnel, right? The apparition of these faces in the crowd. You have a crowd of people. There's faces, so your visual senses are being invoked. And then petals on a wet black bough, right? Again, you're seeing petals. You're seeing a black, maybe wet, a wet branch, right? So there's a tactile imagery there, and there's a visual imagery that's working together to make you visualize this beautiful thing. So now you want to think about, okay, so why and what is being compared? So you have this, you're in a station at the metro, you have these faces in the crowd, maybe you're in the metro on a train passing and you see these faces in the crowd, and then all of a sudden you move to a natural image, right? I don't think he's actually talking about all of a sudden he's outside and he sees petals on a wet black bough. He's comparing these faces in the crowd, in the darkness, these white blurs of people that look like petals, right? To this object of beauty. And what is it invoking you? What feelings do you think about when you think of him contrasting these two very different things? The idea is that in these two short lines, he does invoke some sort of a feeling. If you're not getting a feeling, then start thinking about it a little bit more. Try to understand why Ezra Pound would put these two things together. Another way to think more about it is, when did this take place, right? What year was this written? What was going on in Paris at this time? This is how you close read a poem. You start asking a lot of questions. All right, let's try it again. This is one of my all-time favorite poems. You guys must be loving this. These are very short poems. So pictured in the left-hand corner there is H.D. Hilda Doolittle. She wrote during the same time as Ezra Pound, and she was actually at one time engaged to Ezra Pound, but that's another story. And she wrote this poem, Oread, when she was in a writing group with Ezra Pound, and he adored it. He thought it was one of the best poems that anyone had ever written. So let's look at what Oread is. And just so you know, when these poets were writing about Imagism, they were all, both Ezra Pound and H.D., they were studying Greek literature. They were studying how Greek poets wrote. And one way that Greek poets wrote is they would assume a word the reader of a poem would immediately think of all the connotations surrounding a word when they read it. So when I say the word sea, you would immediately think of a specific sea, water, saltiness, ships, right? You immediately think of all of these associations. When I say pines, you think of, trees, the scent of pines, right? And it's the idea of all of those associations working together to help you understand the meaning of the poem. So let's look this up. The first thing you need to ask yourself when you're reading this poem is, what does the title mean? What is an Oread, right? So you want to look that up. Let's read it aloud. Whirl up, sea, whirl your pointed pines, splash your great pines on our rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. Now in this very short poem, she's invoking the sea, right? Whirling up, the idea of a restless sea, right? Maybe a sea in the storm. and then associating the sea with pointed pines, right? Splash your great pines. You can see that. If you've ever seen a pine forest in a storm, or listened to a pine forest in a wind, it sounds like the sea. It has the same exact sound, and pine needles can look exactly like the sea as they wave in the wind. She's trying to blur that association together, and you can feel both readings of the poem as you read it, and that really makes for a brilliant piece of imagery. You also have rocks, right? And the word hurl your green over us, right? The idea of the sea hurling itself onto the rocks, or the pines whirling themselves onto the rocks. Cover us in your pools of fur, right? So the way you think about this poem is you try to understand what two things are working together in this poem. What are the images in this poem? And how does the imagery work? What are the key images, right? We've got the sea, we've got the pines, right? What order do they appear in? And then we've got the rocks, right? And what order do they appear in? And what does this title suggest? When we look up the title Oread, it'll tell us more about how to read this poem. What senses are being evoked, right? There's visual, right? We've got auditory, right? Tactile, splash, right? Look through it and see, is there more, right? What adjectives or qualifying words are being used to invoke the images in this poem? And what's interesting about this poem is it's actually the verbs that are doing some of the work as well. You've got the whirl, hurl, right? Splash. Those are telling you a lot about the images. But you've got pointed pines, right? Pools of fur, right? These are telling you about the images. What emotions are being suggested by this image? What do you feel when you hear this poem? What do you think's going on? And has the mood changed from the beginning to the end of the poem? And what is suggested by that change? So on this poem, I'd like you to think about it and tell me what you think. All right, but for your conversation, I'd like you to look at another poem by Elizabeth Bishop. It's found on pages 754 and 755. This was written in 1946, and this is a poem that is one of Elizabeth Bishop's most famous poems. What I want you to do is I want you to look closely at the imagery that Bishop uses in the poem. How does she describe the outside of the fish? And how does she describe the inside of the fish? Pay careful attention to all of the adjectives she's using. What does this imagery tell us about how the speaker feels about the fish, and what she thinks the fish thinks about her? Okay. Then finally, what happens in the last lines of the poem? Now, it's really important when you read this poem to look up any words you don't know. For example, towards the end of the poem, there's a lot of nautical terms, words like gunnels, oarlocks, and thwarts. You want to look those up so you understand the whole ending, so you can visualize it. And then finally, why does she let the fish go? I'm also going to add a link to biographical information about Elizabeth Bishop so you can learn more about her and talk about this poem in your conversation. Finally, this week you're going to do your reflection journal. For your reflection journal, you're going to choose one of the following poems: A Route of Evanescence by Emily Dickinson, an amazing poem about a hummingbird. Pied Beauty by Gerald Manley Hopkins. Mid-August at Sourdough Mountain Lookout by Gary Snyder. Now these are all very imagery-rich poems. I have bios here for you to read about the poets. Start off by choosing one of these. Read all three and see which one speaks to you the most. Then choose a poem and read that poem for meaning. And read the biography so you understand who the poet is. Then I want you to look at the imagery in the poem. Look at what the poem's key images are and in what order they appear. Look at the poem's title and tell us what you think it suggests. Tell us what senses are being evoked in the poem. Tell us what attitudes or emotions that the images suggest. And let us know if the mood changes from start to finish, and if so, how. Then tell us what's suggested by the movement from one image to another. Alright guys, so that's it for this week. I do want to say that for this week's content, you have 2 weeks to get it done actually, because you have spring break. So this week's content is not due next Wednesday. It's next Tuesday at 11:59. It's due the following Tuesday at 11:59. So you get a little break to catch up. I also want to say I've been really enjoying reading your first formal essays for this class, and I have been returning them to people as soon as I grade them. I'd love for you to look them over. If you have any questions, reach out to me. And yes, you do have the opportunity to revise your paper, but you must significantly revise it. So you must use all of the information that I provide to you in order to make a better draft. But you can get more points by revising your paper. All right, that's it for this week. I hope you guys have a great break, and I really look forward to seeing you next week seeing you after spring break, when we'll be talking about words in poetry, looking very closely at words and doing a close reading exercise. See you online.